Hello and welcome to another take at Snapshots from the Road to English. I already went through these slides one time yesterday, but because of an unexpected technical issue, the sound quality was somewhat lacking. So I will present the same material, including the subjects that came up in the comments for people who might want to watch this later, for example, on YouTube. So that with the improved sound quality, it will be more enjoyable to listen to. So, let's begin with the Indo-European languages. Some of you may know these, some of you might not, but many of the languages of Europe and northern India and some of the Middle East are related to one another. So what does it mean when languages are related? It means that at some point there was a single language and different forms or dialects of that have become more different from each other until the differences are not small, such as between British English and American English, and instead massive, such as between British English and Bengali, which have split from each other about 5,000 years ago, instead of 500, as with the different kinds of English. So these languages are called Indo-European languages because they are spoken in Europe and India. And the original language that they split off from, we call Proto-Indo-European. We do not know what the people of that time called it. It is also not quite clear how the language splintered. Some of the language groups that descend from it are clearly more closely related to each other than to the others, but some of them are hazy as to how they are related to some of the other groups. One of the clear groups are the Italo-Celtic languages, which contain the Italic languages, including Latin and all of the Romance languages of today, such as Italian, French, Portuguese, and the Celtic languages, which have almost disappeared today and only survive on the fringes of the British Isles and northwestern France, and contain languages such as Irish and Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, Cornish, Breton, and historically Gaulish, if you have read Asterix, and the other Celtic languages of southern Central Europe, where they have disappeared. There are still some place names in Schwarzwald and Juragebirge in the southern German language area that survive from the Celtic period. Then the Germanic languages, which contain German, English, Norwegian, Icelandic, may be closely related to the Italo-Celtic languages, or they may be more closely related to the Balto-Slavic languages. More on that later. This is simply, we just don't know. Considering that the Indo-European languages appear to have split somewhere in Ukraine, north of the Black Sea, it seems likely that all of these languages might be related to each other through a route of migration along northern Central Europe. But we just don't know. And the Baltic and Slavic languages are another pair that are clearly very closely related to each other. The Baltic languages contain Latvian and Lithuanian, and historically Prussian, but the Prussian language was eliminated during the Middle Ages, and the people we usually call Prussians are German immigrants to the area of Prussia, and the later Duchy and Kingdom of Prussia that was dominated by the Germans. The Slavic languages are closely related to the Baltic ones, but had a much greater dispersal in the early Middle Ages. So if you imagine how Russian or Polish or Bulgarian sounded in the Roman period, it would be much more similar to Lithuanian, the famously conservative Baltic language. Staying within Europe, we have Albanian, which today is the only language that survives, but it might have been one of the Illyrian languages in antiquity, here in current Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, which today have become Slavic speaking. The Greek languages also contain only Greek, but the Armenian languages, which also only contain Armenian, have a peculiar similarity with Greek, even though these are spoken on opposite ends of the Black Sea. It may be that these two began as a single dialect group, but were later have split somewhere here relatively north, and one branch went west and the other east. We don't know. Again, unfortunately, the amount of information about the split up of the Indo-European languages is very small, because this happened thousands of years before any of these languages were written down, so we don't have any data points until much later. And then, getting into the Anatolian languages, you might not have heard of any of them because all of them have disappeared, but these were the first branch to split off from the other Indo-European languages. If you are familiar with Age of Empires, the old strategy game, you may remember the Hittites, or if you have heard of the mythical kings Midas or Croesus, they were all Anatolian speakers. Going further east, the Iranian languages, which you might identify as the same word as the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Indo-Aryan languages are a third pair that are very closely related. Here, Iranian and Aryan are cognates, which means that these were originally the same word, but it has developed in a different way, in a different direction in the different branches. So this word is Iran in the Iranian branch and Arya in the Indo-Aryan branch. These two are common. These two branches together are usually called the Aryan languages. Iranian languages naturally contain Persian, the majority language of Iran, as well as Kurdish, a large minority language in eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, but also Ossetian, a small minority language north of the Caucasus, and historically contain the Scythian and Sarmatian languages, which you might have heard if you enjoy some Rome Total War games, for example. And those were spoken here further north. And what is today Turkic-speaking Central Asia was also Iranian-speaking during antiquity. And the last branch is the Tocharian branch, which was spoken in the Tarim Basin in what is today Xinjiang, in the most western part of China. These languages disappeared during the Middle Ages, and if you have heard of some red-headed mummies in China, those were Tocharians. Fairly little is known about these languages. We only know that they existed because they did write things down, but they were not prolific writers, so we know fairly little about them. So Germanic languages are the ones that eventually resulted in English. So we'll start with some of the sound changes from Proto-Indo-European into Proto-Germanic. And here we begin with Grimm's law. This Grimm is Jacob Grimm, the brother of Wilhelm Grimm. And these brothers were very influential in Germanic philology of the early 19th century. In addition to discovering this historical process, they were involved with das Deutsche Wörterbuch, one of the earliest dictionary projects in Europe, similar to the Oxford English Dictionary. But of course, German and the work on it began decades earlier than in Oxford. He also wrote seminal works on Germanic mythology and fairy tales. I'm sure you've heard of Grimm's fairy tales, and those are the same Grimm's as in this case. And what they discovered was that there had been a massive shift in the sounds between Proto-Indo-European and Germanic. And here we have these chains. The first row here are labial consonants, so they are produced with the lips, and they change from one to the next. So if you had a b in Proto-Indo-European, you end up with a b in Germanic, and so on and so on. The second row are alveolar consonants. They are produced with the alveolar ridge, which is the bump behind the teeth in the front of your mouth. The third are velar consonants, pronounced with the velum, which is the back part of the roof of the mouth. And the final row are labialized velar consonants, which means that once you begin to pronounce this consonant, you make a secondary articulation with the lips. So, for example, quo, such as in equus in Latin for horse, you tense the k, and at the release of this tension, you make a w with the lips. So instead of k, w, it's quo. That is what the superscript letters here mean. They are these secondary articulations. And the first column on the left also has an H. In superscript, this means that it is an aspirated consonant. So again, you tense the consonant, and then when you release it, you let out a strong stream of air. So b, not b, h, and instead b. I have found words to illustrate all of these sound changes. We will have the Proto-Indo-European word, the Proto-Germanic word, the English word, and some comparisons from other Indo-European languages. Many of these are names for family members, because that sort of words are very difficult to replace, even in a case where a huge amount of the vocabulary has been changed. For example, English has a huge amount of Latin vocabulary, from Latin, Spanish and French, but these are largely the more educated vocabulary. You still hold things with your hand and you love your mother, not something like manu for hand, or something like mother is actually fairly similar with the Latin words for that, so a bad example. The extreme example of this is the Maltese language spoken on Malta, a small island in the southern Mediterranean, which was originally Arabic, but has become extensively relexicalized. So almost all of the vocabulary of Maltese comes from Latin Romance languages, such as French, Spanish, Italian, but the core vocabulary, such as body parts, family members, sky, have remained Arabic. So, finally getting into the examples. Proto-Indo-European for brother was breter. The accent mark means that the first syllable is accented, and the macaron here means that the vowel is long. This has become brother in Proto-Germanic. Fairly similar. The Proto-Indo-European had free stress, so you had you could have words where the first syllable is stressed, or the second syllable, or a third. In the Germanic languages, this became systematized, so that in native Germanic vocabulary, the first syllable is always the stressed one. In English, this is fairly often not the case, because loan words in English often hold on to the stress pattern of the original language. So, for example, if you have a French word, French, on the other hand, has a systematic stress on the final syllable. So if you use a French word in English, often it is pronounced as in French, so the opposite of the original Germanic system. And brother is very similar to brother. Between these, not much has occurred. In comparison, Sanskrit is a classical language of India, one of the Indo-Aryan languages, and culturally a similar phenomenon as Latin for Western Europe. Brother was bratra, so the b has been retained. I don't know if the b still survives in modern Indian languages. I don't know any of them. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't. In general, these aspirated voiced stops were only retained in the Indo-Aryan languages. And as comparison, the Latin for brother is frater. Here the first consonant is an F, and you may notice that it is in the same chain here up top, but in the Italic languages, the first point here, the voiced aspirated stops, have jumped directly to the end, to the fricatives. So where you had a b in Proto-Indo-European, you have an f in Latin. And words that had g have a h in Latin. So, moving on. The next one is apple, hebol. I'm being confused continuously by the accent marks and the macrons, because unfortunately for different historical languages, different marking systems are used. So there are sometimes you see languages being written out so that the accent mark means a long vowel instead of a stressed syllable. And this always gets me. There are also numbers under some of the H's for Proto-Indo-European. These go from 1 to 3. And the problem is that we don't exactly know which H-like sounds these were. They were something like in Buch in German, or like ich in German, or but we are not quite sure. They have mostly disappeared in the following languages. Here we have the voiced lip consonant has become a non-voiced in A+, fairly similar with apple, whereas it has been retained in the Russian yabloko, where the B is the same as the B in Proto-Indo-European. And finally, father is der, a horrifying consonant cluster in the beginning, and had become father in Proto-Germanic. Here we see that in addition to the T becoming an th, it has become the voiced the. So it is this musical note symbol. And this is Werner's law, another almost diagnostic sound change for the Germanic languages. Here, the first syllable was originally unstressed, and consonants at the start of a syllable that comes after an unstressed syllable have become voiced. So may have been into T into the, and then voiced into the, or it might have been the into the, and then the. No, that I don't think that way would work. There is some controversy as to whether Grimm's law or Werner's law occurred first. I've recently read an article arguing that Werner's law was actually the first one to occur, but right now it is I'm only confusing myself because I would have to think about it in peace, so to say how it would have worked. The conventional idea is that Grimm's law came first. So in that case, it would be the into the and the into the. And father is extremely similar with father. And again, in Latin, the p has been retained for pater. Then honey, medu, in Proto-Indo-European becomes medus in Proto-Germanic, but has remained madhu in Sanskrit. And this has the cognate for this word is mead, but mead has come to mean something slightly different than honey. And it is the beer or wine, an alcoholic drink made out of honey. Often these shifts in meaning are fairly slight, such as in this case. You can easily see how the word might come to mean the alcohol made from honey. Then decem. Here's there's a circle around under the M, and this means that this is a syllabic consonant, and that means that there are two syllables in this word, and in one of them, instead of a vowel, like in the first one with E, you have an M. That is being held for a longer time. These have disappeared in most Indo-European languages, but they exist in some of the Slavic languages. For example, there's an island in Croatia called Krak, and wolf in Czech is vlk. So, decem became dehun in Proto-Germanic. Here I have written this with an H. This is the convention for the Germanic languages because they don't have other H-like sounds. The usual symbol for this sound looks like an X, and it's the same sound as in Buch in German. So it's an H that is pronounced at the same area as K. And this is also how Buch became Buch in German. So you can see that the area where the consonant is being made does not change, only the nature of the consonant changes. So this has come to mean, this still means 10, and it has remained fairly similar with the original form in Latin, where only the syllabic consonant has disappeared and has been replaced with an E for decem. Then we have goose. This is very difficult for me to pronounce because it has an aspirated consonant followed by an aspirant. So geus, gens, very similar to gans. If we ignore the aspirants, goose in German is still gans, so there's almost no change between those, but it has become goose in English, and we will get to how this happened later in this presentation. And the example in this case is from archaic Greek. Is this ken? I was not able to find a cognate of hens that would have retained the g. In this case, it has turned into a k. Still aspirated, but not quite the same. Next one, cold. Goltos in Proto-Indo-European becomes kaldas in Proto-Germanic. Again with Werner's law here in the second syllable. This is cold. Again, fairly little change to English. In Latin, ice was gelu. This is more similar with the goltos. And in modern Italian, it has become gelato, which usually means ice cream in modern Italian. No longer ice in general or more abstractly cold. The next one to recite was seng. This is just a stem. If you actually use this word, you would have to add a further marker at the end, so it would not end in this horrifying consonant. This became singwana in Proto-Germanic. So the wa, gwa remains, but the g has disappeared. And this becomes sing in English, but I was unfortunately not able to find any nice cognates that would retain the g. Probably because it is a very complicated cluster. Then living, which was becomes quick was in Proto-Germanic and quick in English. Again, I was unable to find nice cognates for this. And the final example to follow is sequa in Proto-Indo-European becomes sehwana in Proto-Germanic, sehen in modern German, and see in modern English. And for example, in Latin, to follow was sequi. You might have heard this in non sequitur, which means does not follow, and is a rhetorical concept. So if you say something that has nothing to do with an argument, a pretentious person might post non sequitur at you. This is also something that has occurred in the question words. So what is Latin for what, and the Proto-Indo-European for what was something fairly similar. But in Old English it is what. You may have heard someone from the southern parts of the United States say what or whale for the large sea mammal. And this is actually the original way that those words were pronounced. The h at the beginning has since disappeared. So then we get into the West Germanic umlaut. Taking a look at the map. The original Germanic language was spoken somewhere here, Denmark, Scania, so southern Scandinavia. And that the first to split from this were the East Germanic languages, which ended up being spoken in current Poland, and these contain the Gothic languages, which have since disappeared. And then what differentiated the northern, so Scandinavian, and western, so continental Germanic languages was this were the umlauts. This did not happen in East Germanic, but they happened separately in North and West Germanic. So a very similar process happened with slightly different input. This is the example for Western Germanic, and umlaut is literally a round sound, and this is a process where different syllables within the same word influence each other, so that the vowels in these syllables become more similar with each other, so that the word itself is easier to pronounce. The example words here are mouse and mice. You may have noticed in English that this is a very weird plural. Usually you have like cat and cats, but you have mouse and mice. And the second one is foot and feet. Why are these different? Well, this is why. The original plural for these was an e and a z, is, at the end of the word. So you had one moose and several mouses. So this would have been regular and understandable even for modern English speakers. Or one fort or several forties, several foots. In the Western Germanic languages, the z at the end of the word disappeared. In the Northern Germanic languages, this became an r. So if you run into some Viking names or words in Old Norse that have an r at the end, those generally had a z at the end in Proto-Germanic. And then eventually this z disappears in Western Germanic, and now you have one moose, several muusi. And this is where the umlaut comes in. So you have mu, which is this is a back vowel made with the tongue at the back of the mouth, and you have c. E is a front vowel made as front as possible. So switching between these two is actually fairly difficult. And because of this, the plural for mouse became musi. So not quite mice, but we will get to further developments along the way. Here the O with a line through it is Ö. So the Western Germanic umlauted form was 1/4 and several 30. Then, getting back to the maps, we get the North Sea Germanic nasal spirant law, which is a nightmare of a word. Spirant is an old word for fricative. And the North Sea Germanic languages were spoken along the North Sea, so this naming is extremely descriptive. And this group contains, from the modern languages, English, Frisian, which has almost disappeared, and North German, Low German, which is also almost disappeared. In these languages, words which had a vowel, so freely moving air, R, A, E, a nasal consonant, so a consonant where you interfere with the airflow so that part of the air goes through the nose, such as n, m, ng, and a fricative, which is a consonant where you turn the airflow turbulent with usually with the tongue, so s, f, f. In these cases, the middle, so the nasal consonant, has disappeared. Here we have again some examples. Us in Germanic was uns, and it is still uns in High German, but becomes us and later us in English and Frisian. For Low German, these changes have been rolled back so that Low German started on this process towards a different kind of language, but because they were in constant contact with the Dutch and High German branches and also the North German languages, this weirdness of the disappearing N was the N's were reintroduced from the neighboring languages where this change did not happen. For English, the Anglic languages were on an island, so they were not constantly being influenced by languages that retained the N's. Then another, anderas, becomes other, without the N in English, and andere in German, where the V has become a D, but the N has survived. And then soft was sanfto, becomes soft, and sanft in German. The nasal consonant has changed into another one, but there is still one of those. Then the next one is anglo-frisian palatalization. Here we get into the anglo-frisian languages, which contain English and Frisian. Frisian is today a tiny minority language in northeastern Netherlands, but it used to cover up to the coast, up to the west coast of current Denmark, whereas then Low German was speaken around this area in the further inland. And in this, palatalization means that consonants have become more palatal. So they move towards the palate, which is the front part of the roof of the mouth. Here we have velar consonants that are made with the back part of the roof of the mouth, and they become palatal consonants that are made with the front of the roof of the mouth, because there's a front vowel in the vicinity. So it is easier to pronounce in the new way. This has happened both with old K's, become ch, such as kirke for church, and ik has become ich. The ch has since then disappeared in English, and it became e for a while, and then became I later, which we will get to in the next slide. This is also what has happened in, for example, Italian. Cesare has become Cesare. And for S and SK cluster, it became just an sh. So in a way you have this crossed, that simple consonant becomes a consonant group, and the consonant group becomes a single consonant. Here we have the examples skep, which used to mean ship, and here we can see that this is pronounced ship in modern English. It is also pronounced ship in ship in modern Swedish, and schiff in modern High German. So a similar process has occurred, but at a different time and separately from English. And another word, skort, means short and is pronounced short in modern English. But there are also words where these K's have survived. Skipper, as in a kind of a captain, is a Dutch loanword. And skirt, as in a piece of clothing, is a North Germanic loanword. So Norwegian or Danish. And the reason that these survive is that these sound change processes stay active only for a certain time. And once the process has ended, new words that enter the language no longer become transformed. So skip had already become ship, and this process had ended, and after that, the same original word was loaned from Dutch, where this had not occurred. And then the K has survived. This a similar process has occurred in Dutch since then. For example, if you fly to Amsterdam, you might land on the airport of Schiphol. This is would have originally been Schiphol, but the K has become H, much as the way in German for book into Buch, skip into Schip. This is quite difficult for me to pronounce, unfortunately. And then, really the last process that brings us to modern English is the great vowel shift. This happened in English, which is one of the Anglic languages, but for example has not happened in Scots, a Germanic language spoken in Scotland, but not so. Is Scots then English or not? This is a matter of definition. Patriotic English people would certainly say that it is. Patriotic Scottish people would say that it is not. I would say that it is not, but I don't think either of those would listen to me. And speaking of Scotland, there are actually 3 languages that could be called Scottish. One of these is Scottish Gaelic, which is a Celtic language, very closely related to Irish Gaelic. The second one is Scots, which is an Anglic language that split off from English in the migrations era. And then you have Scottish English, which is has developed from has split off again from English, and this is usually the language that you hear Scottish people speak. Scots is a minority language even in Scotland. So, for example, when you hear Sean Connery speak and you can understand him, but he sounds distinctly Scottish, that is Scottish English. If you hear someone speaking kind of English in Scotland, but you can't understand any of it, that's probably Scots. Hello, Shinhiles. Don't remember if you were here yesterday, but I'm doing a retake to repair some of the sound issues of the last run yesterday. You'll be able to listen to everything on YouTube, so everything that you missed will be available. But getting back to the Great Vowel Shift, this is something that happened in the 15th, 16th centuries. The author Geoffrey Chaucer wrote in the 1300s, if I remember correctly. And his language was still noticeably more German than modern English. For example, I was still each, and many of the silent letters of modern English were still pronounced. For example, knife that you cut with was still pronounced knife. And night, as in the part of time that is not day, was nicht. Knight, as in a soldier on horseback, was knecht. These last two are very similar with the modern German variants, Nacht and Knecht. And even the grammar of Geoffrey Chaucer was still fairly German-like. For example, when you say, I have made, in German you say, ich habe gemacht. There's a ge at the beginning of the verb. And this was still the case in Chaucerian English. So if you try to read Chaucer, you might run into something like ich habe gemacht. So it seems like it might appear like a between point between English and German. But if you read Shakespeare, Shakespearean English is clearly modern English. You might not be able to understand it. It was several hundred years ago. But, for example, the Great Vowel Shift has occurred, and many of these silent letters had become silent by that point. And actually, the reason that English has such a difficult writing system, orthography, is that there has been no spelling reform in English since centuries ago. So, when Chaucer was writing, English was written the way it was pronounced, but then there were massive changes while people kept writing the way they had. And that is the way we get the horrible writing system of English. But finally into the Great Vowel Shift. This has two parts. This is a process that affected the long vowels in stressed syllables. And there are two branches. One is diphthongization, where long single vowels become diphthongs, so you move from one vowel into another within one syllable. And the other one is vowel raising, where a single vowel is moved towards the top of the mouth. So it is physically, the tongue is physically raised. So we end up at the modern pronunciation. And here, if you can read International Phonetic Alphabet, you might notice that the old pronunciation of these words is very similar to the way they are written. So, bite is written bite, mate is written mate, out is not written ud, but somewhat more close to it. And boat is again not pronounced boat, but somewhat similar. Here this backward C symbol is a low O. So this is, imagine an R but you round the lips, so it is pronounced with the tongue lower in the mouth than the normal O. So you can understand why they might write it as an O and an A together. Then getting into the rest vowels, meat and meat, as in to meet a person or eat some meat, are not pronounced differently in modern English, but they used to be. So the process of meeting a friend used to be meet, so an A with the tongue fairly high in the mouth, whereas the substance that you eat was meat with the tongue lower in the mouth. Again, A is a vowel that is made with the tongue very low in the mouth, so you can understand why they would choose to write A as A-A, because it's sort of in the middle. And the last one here is boot, as in something that you put in your shoe, put in your foot, and this used to be bought, the way it is written. Please note that this also only occurred for long vowels. So getting into the final topic, goose fronting. Goose is also obviously a word where which was originally pronounced goose. And so we have, as the process from Germanic into English, we have gans. In the North Sea Germanic languages, the N is lost, so you have gas. And this has turned into a goose at some point, and then into goose during the Great Vowel Shift. But you have an adult goose, but the baby is a gosling, not a gooseling, because this process only occurred for the long vowels. So from one adult goose and a baby gosling, you get one adult goose, but a baby gosling, because the O in the last word is short. So this process of goose fronting does not actually occur usually with the word goose. It's a little bit confusing, but because English philologists do not like to use the International Phonetic Alphabet, they prefer to use diagnostic words such as goose. And they say the goose vowel to mean oo. In this process, when you have a coronal consonant, so a consonant that is made with the tip of the tongue, such as t or r, which you don't have in English, but you get the idea. These move the oo forward in the mouth, because the oo is pronounced very back in the mouth, and these consonants are pronounced at the front of the mouth. So the oo becomes an oo. So to me becomes to me. You might say this yourself. I certainly do. This process has gone the furthest in South African English, which unfortunately is not very familiar to most people. But this process is advancing around the world. And it is even beginning to spread to other contexts. So, for example, this example of cool. K is not a coronal consonant. So it would actually be easier to pronounce cool as cool. But some English speakers around the world are beginning to pronounce it as cool. This is an indication that this change has gone wild, so to say, and has begun to overtake the entire oo. So it is entirely possible that in 100 or 200 years' time, no one would say goose. They would always say goose, even though this is currently not really a thing that occurs. This process had already begun about more than 100 years ago in the Victorian era. So if you go 200 years back, tune, as in to tune an instrument, would have still been pronounced tune. But this context with the y in front of the oo began to change to be fronted much earlier. So around the time of the First World War, you already had a tune with the more front Y. So this is a process that is spreading, might become universal, and it might be something that, it might even be something that differentiates different kinds of English in the future. With that, we are done. Showing the map again a little bit. I went into excuse me, I can't remember the English word now. A branch talking about the different language groups in Europe, but I am planning an entire episode on that, so let's not repeat that. I'll show you some of the maps that I drew. Here are some of the Germanic languages. The Gothic languages may have originated in Gotland, here in eastern Sweden, and it may be that they moved across the sea into current Poland directly, because we have no indication of Eastern Germanic languages around the land part here. And the Eastern Germanic languages went on to disappear. The Goths and the Vandals had adventures around southern Europe and became kings of Italy, of Spain, of northern Africa. There were even Vandals in Tunisia. But these small amounts of Germans were assimilated into the local populations and no longer exist. And then the Northern Germanic languages are today spoken in Denmark and Scandinavia, the Western Germanic on the continent and on the British Isles. This is my map of the North Sea Germanic languages. And this had something to do with the history of Low German, which is actually a fairly conservative language that has almost disappeared, because since High German became the standard language in Germany, there have been concentrated efforts to eliminate the minority language in northern Germany. I know people who still speak Low German, Plattdeutsch in German, but it's quite rare. Both of these people that I know come from the northern coast of Germany. And then this arrow this arrow is the migration path into Britain. The point here is where Frisian is currently spoken, and the circle here is where Low German was spoken at that time. There were also the Franks, that France is named after, were also Germans, and again they formed an elite for the Kingdom of West France, but were fairly quickly assimilated into the Latin-speaking population of France. So this one is something to do with the current languages. The circles here are the states of the Federal Republic of Germany that are named after the Saxons. You have Saxony in the southeast, then you have Saxony-Anhalt, which used to be a part of Saxony but was conquered by the Kingdom of Prussia. And then you have Low Germany around the Old Saxon area. So where Low German core areas, but this is also an area where Low German has become eliminated. And then for the Germanic languages in Great Britain, in the Middle Ages you had Scots in Scotland, English in England, and the Scottish Highlands, Ireland, Wales and Cornwall were still Celtic speaking. But this is not really the case anymore. I think Welsh is the strongest of these, but even Welsh is basically only spoken in rural mountainous areas of Wales. And here we have the maps for the language groups in Europe. But let's get back to that on its with an actual episode. So I noticed a question Yes. How influential is the Gaelic language to modern French? When we are talking about the Celtic languages of France, it is Gaulish, as in Gaul. The Gallia, the Latin name for this area. And not a lot, actually. The France was very thoroughly Latinized by the Romans during the Roman period. I can't think of any direct influence in French. If you get into Rheto-Romance, so Rhetia, which was so the Celtic core areas, here we actually might have a process of influence from Celtic into High German, because these areas were originally Celtic speaking, but they were already Latinized in antiquity. So these people spoke a kind of Romance language. But it appears that these areas retained some Celtic influence in it, possibly because this is a very mountainous and peripheral area for the Roman Empire, whereas southern France was the most Italian of the provinces, and northern France is flat. So even if it was not particularly nice for Italians to live in, it was still not a freezing mountain like Rhetia was. So you had Celtic substrate in the Latin of southern Germany, and then when you have the Germanic languages spreading into southern Germany, there is a hypothesis. It is not known exactly why this happened, but one of the ideas is this Celtic substrate in the Rheto-Romance substrate of High German. That the weird sound changes getting into German, like Buch becomes Buch, Ich becomes Ich, Plum becomes Pflaume, Post becomes Pfost, that kind of things. Those may be Celtic influences in High German. When it comes to the Latin of France, there are basically two main groups. There are the langues d'oïl, which contains French. These are named after the word for yes, which is derived from hoc ille in Latin. And the southern French language area, the word was hoc, also from hoc ille. The northern langues d'oïl languages are very much influenced by German, actually, Germanic. The Franks that conquered France and set themselves up as the elite. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I can't give any particular examples of this. This is a possible future topic, but I have not prepared for this today, so I can't give any real specifics. The Langstok, so the Oc languages, also contain Catalan, which is a minority, well, an aerial language in eastern Spain. It is the majority language of a large part of Spain, but this area is a minority of the population of Spain. And today Catalonia is basically where the Occitan language survives, because it has been very effectively eliminated from France in the last 200 years. Originally, Catalan was part of the Western dialect group of Occitan with Béarnais and Gascon, but the latter two have basically disappeared. So, I think that's about it. Thank you for asking questions. This was I love talking about languages, even if it's a topic that I am not quite prepared to take on right now. So I'll be uploading this one to YouTube. La missa è finita. Thank you for attending my TED Talk. I'll have to add my avatar to the file before I add this on YouTube. But see you next week. Thank you for coming and have a good day.